Welcome to the final 2021 session of the Disability and Philanthropy Forum's Journey to Inclusion Learning Series, brought to you by the President's Council on Disability, Inclusion, and Philanthropy. My name is Emily Harris. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm proud to be part of the disability community. I'm the director of the President's Council and come to you from the land of the Council of Three Fires, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, now known as the City of Chicago. My access needs are met today with live captioning. As part of our commitment to accessibility, our speakers and I will each provide a short audio description. I'm a white woman with dark curly hair wearing rectangular glasses and a black shirt with white polka dots over a white turtleneck. Behind me is a screen made of rectangles of blonde wood and white paper. A few housekeeping items for today's learning session. The recording of today's session will focus on the speakers and the moderator. There may be one or two moments when we show gallery view. Feel free to leave your camera off if you have any concerns. You'll receive a link to the recorded parts of the session in approximately 10 days. We have live captioning today. There are two ways to action these captions. Use the CC button at the bottom of your screen and choose subtitles or full transcript, which will pop up as a box on your screen within Zoom. If you prefer to access the captions in a separate window, a link to the external captioner is now in the chat. During the first part of our program today, we will be spotlighting our speakers, and you will be muted. During this moderated discussion, there will be 3 poll questions about our topic today for you to respond to. These Zoom polls can be accessed by screen readers. To navigate the poll with your screen reader, follow the instructions in the chat. They are there now and will also be posted when the questions are asked. After about 45 minutes of moderated discussion, there will be a Q&A session. You can place questions in the chat, and our moderator and speaker will address as many questions as we can. We will use the chat throughout this session to share links to information, and you can use it too to post questions anytime. You can also send questions to assistant@disabilityphilanthropy.org. This session is scheduled for 90 minutes, but we understand that many people will have a hard stop after about 60 minutes, and we'll conclude the formal program by then. We'll pause at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a moment with a few announcements, and then continue an optional conversation from 1 to 1:30 for those who can stay. This will be your time to interact with the panelists. During that time, we will continue taking questions in the chat, and we will also invite you to go off mute and share your questions verbally. The program will wrap up no later than 1:30 Eastern Time. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to highlight a few things. First, disability is a natural part of the human experience, and there are more than 60 million of us in the US alone. Disabilities can be apparent or non-apparent, lifelong or acquired. And disability identity is only one part of each person's identity. We represent all aspects of diversity. Second, like other forms of oppression, the barriers to full participation in our society are socially constructed and can be dismantled if we are intentional. Finally, we recognize the founding disability rights and justice principle, nothing about us without us. Today, you'll hear from leaders with disabilities who have expertise in diversity, equity, and inclusion and human resources. I'm particularly excited about our session today because we recently launched the Disability Inclusion Pledge, a series of commitments for philanthropy. To date, 56 foundations and philanthropy-serving organizations have signed on. If yours has not, please see the link in the chat and encourage your CEO to join us. Pledge signatories agree to use best practices for recruiting, retaining, and promoting people with disabilities on their staff and boards, and to create a culture of inclusion within their organizations. And today's discussion will address many of these best practices. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for today, Zakia Mayberry, who is an author, international speaker, and consultant. Her bio is in the chat, as are those of all our speakers. Again, feel free to use the chat at any time during the discussion to post your questions, and we will hold them for a Q&A period at the end. Zakia, you're on.
Thank you so much, Emily, for giving those remarks. I'm so pleased to be here today with each one of you. I am a Black woman. I'm wearing glasses that have animal print. My hair is pulled back in a ponytail. A couple of my locks are to the forward of my face. I have on bright pink lipstick, a Black top, and a silver chain with some colors. I am proud as well to be part of the disability community. My adjectives are she and her. I come to you from all across the globe, really, because my dad was in the military. I grew up in Germany and spent a lot of time in the DMV area, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. But right now I'm in Georgia. And I'm very happy to be a part of this conversation today. It's going to be a very robust conversation. This conversation is also personal to me. As a marginalized individual with multiple disabilities, even though I've worked in the HR suite, worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I too have encountered bias, discrimination, and it doesn't feel good. So we're going to have a conversation that might feel a little uncomfortable, but it's going to help move the needle forward with these types of conversations. I'm pleased to welcome our experts, such as Sarah, Joel. And rather than read their bios, I think it's best for them to introduce themselves to you and tell you why it's important for them to be here and a part of this conversation today. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Zakia. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Napoli, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am coming to you from the land of the Lenape Nation, currently New York City metro area, but on the Jersey side of the Hudson. My access needs are being met today by live captioning and also the fact that I can turn off my camera and move around as I deal with chronic pain. I am a white woman with longer dark blonde hair with some red still in the tips, some sparkles of gray. I have blue eyes and I'm wearing a V-neck top with a black sweater and I have a silver chain. My background is my bedroom, so it's very hard to not take a rest. I identify as a proudly disabled woman, and I have made it my life's work to make people really uncomfortable. I'm a trainer and an educator, and I really strongly believe that in order to have real learning on intersectional justice and DEI issues, you need to be uncomfortable. So that is me. I'm very excited to be here today, and I guess I'll pass the mic to Joelle.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so happy to be in community with you, with Dr. Zakia, and with everyone on this call. So nice to see many of you and hear many of you. My name is Joel Hernandez. My pronouns are he and they. I'm a brown-skinned Latinx male with a very low Caesar haircut. I also have a thin mustache and a beard. I'm wearing a purple and pink plaid shirt, button-down shirt, and I am sitting on a chair in my bedroom. And in the background, I have a painting of half of an owl in a teal canvas, and there's also a fan right above my head. And I also have bright red headphones for noise cancellation. So my access needs are met for today. And I'm calling in from the land of the Wappinger people, who are an Eastern Algonquian, Munsee-speaking Native American people from what is now Southern New York. And I'm specifically in the area that many know as the New York borough of the Bronx. I'm currently the Senior Manager of Talent Acquisition at Jobs for the Future. And I was formerly at the Ford Foundation as a talent acquisition associate, where I got the chance to truly live into my disability identity, which I'm so proud of, and had the pleasure of meeting Emily and Dr. Zakia and Sarah and others. So I can't tell you all how excited and delighted I am to be in community and in conversation with you all. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel and Sarah, for being here. I can just feel your energy from across the screen and it feels wonderful. So now we're going to jump into a poll question. And you can access the poll by going into the chat feature. The first poll question is in reference to social model. Do you feel your organization uses languages that is reflective of the social model of disability? Yes, no, or maybe you're not sure. And this is so cool because we get to see the results real time. Wow, the numbers are coming in. We're just going to give it a few more moments. And right now, it looks like it is almost a split between yes and I'm not sure. But I think that I'm not sure has it by a slim margin. 47% states they're not sure, and 16% is no, and 37% is yes. That's interesting. We're going to dive more into this a bit later, but thank you so much for participating in our first poll questions. And there you see all the results for yourself. I'm going to share a bit of a personal story about myself and my disabilities. When I was in high school, I had a teacher when I was preparing to go to college that stated that he didn't think I was college material. I was in special education, had a learning disability, and that really crushed my self-esteem. Luckily, I had my parents there, advocates who came to the school, worked with the guidance counselor to get me the accommodations I needed to take the SAT. And look where I am now. I have a bachelor's in psychology, a master's degree in leadership and management, and my PhD in global studies and divinity. So when we're discussing this topic about diversity, equity, and inclusion in HR, it's very important, especially right now with all that's gone on in history. So do you feel that your organization uses language that is reflective of the social model? We just answered that, and I'm glad that we talked about that. So I'm going to pass the first question off to Sarah. What do we mean by this when we ask this question? What is the language reflective of a social model? Can you explain that a little for our participants?
Yes, of course. And thank you so much for sharing your story. I can relate as someone who spent 30 to 40 days a year when I was in high school in the hospital or in different situations where I had to try to learn from home. So remote learning and working is in my history. So kind of amazing how we're all doing it now successfully when it was a problem in the past. And that sort of is how we define the social model, right? The social model is saying that we are only disabled by the environment, which creates obstacles that inhibit us from participating in the world, right? So even though I strongly identify as disabled and I'm proud of that identity, it's a social script that I've created for myself and about my own learning and understanding about who I am. And I find that I lead with that. And I talk about it in an intersectional lens as someone who grew up working class. I call myself bi-class now because I am now middle class. I'm proud of that as well, of all my achievements. But those intersections as a white woman who's disabled, who identifies as part of the LGBT community as well. I mean, those intersections matter. And so being able to bring my whole self to work, and I think is part of that social model understanding. You know, there's this disconnect, and I hear this a lot in the HR world, that we are unable to bridge social model and compliance, right? And this idea that as HR practitioners, which, to be completely honest and forthright, I am not. This is my first job in HR. I'm currently working at Open Society Foundations in my first ever role within an HR team. So I don't necessarily come from the human resources world. And I think that's why it's been easier for me to sort of break out of compliance and move beyond that. But we still, and I'll use OSF as a bit of a case study, we still have to work within the parameters of compliance. So for our US offices, that would be the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act. For our London office, the UK Equality Act, and we can go beyond, and I can talk about every region we work in, which would take too long. But everyone has sort of recommendations and requirements that are standard by their jurisdiction that we have to follow. Yet in theory and in the way that we talk about disability is coming from a social model perspective. And so you can bridge those two worlds between compliance and how do we just lead with empathy and treat people like human beings and make sure that we're setting up an environment where everyone can thrive. And the social model is really meant to sort of build up those inclusive spaces from the get-go. And I know that's really hard. So I'm not saying, go in, and we've actually just designed our London office in a very inclusive manner. And, they tried so hard to think of every single thing you can imagine to create an inclusive space. And you're still going to get someone who comes in and says, that color gave me a migraine. So you can't possibly do everything, but you can think proactively. And that's the space I want to live in, is a place that's not reactionary. And, that's often where disability gets left. Something happens, somebody doesn't have access. Now let's make a change. Let's not do that. So luckily for us and our DEI team, disability inclusion is one of our strategic goals. So we've been able to embed that proactive work very well over the past few years. And I hope I can share a little bit more about how we've done that. But I'll also say that disabled folks are extraordinarily flexible. We are used to being creative and navigating spaces that are not built for us. And so whenever the space has been set up for me, when I walk in, I don't even know what to do. I'm like, wait, I don't have to work so hard to access my needs. I could just show up and be myself and do my work effectively. And so that's what we mean by social model, identifying the environment as disabling and not individuals.
Thank you, Sarah. You said a mouthful of wonderful gems, and I hope you watching this are taking notes. And I'm glad that you're able to show up and just be your authentic self in your work environment. And if y'all need someone to come to London with you to check out things, I love the UK. As we pass this over to Jewel, please tell us what the Ford Foundation has done to integrate culture of inclusion in its recruiting and retention, because that's a lot of times where organizations miss the mark at the retention part. So you get people in, but what about how you connect the two?
Thank you so much for that question, Zakia. And Sarah, thank you for so elaborately talking about the social model, which I think is so important. I think one of the ways that the Ford Foundation really, when I was there, really integrated and still does integrate a culture of inclusion was through various ways. But one of the things that as a recruiter that was really, really powerful was right at the very beginning in that application process, right? Not waiting right until we extended an offer to ask someone whether or not they needed a reasonable accommodation, right? It started as soon as the person applied to that role, right? And when we were inviting people to an interview, we included an embedded language in our invitations that said, hey, thank you so much for applying. Do you need anything further to fully participate on this call, right? So we are already stating that we are here if you need support, if you need anything, further to fully participate on this call. So it was small things like that that really go a long way, that is really signaling to candidates oh, wow, that's an invitation, even though I might not be in a place in my journey, right, to disclose, that already is starting to signal to me okay, they understand, they're inclusive, right? So I might not even in that moment be willing to self-ID, but throughout every single stage of the process, we were communicating to candidates hey, I know I've asked you this already, but please let me know if you need anything further, including, the preference and platform, right? Whether or not WebEx or Zoom, was a preference because of captioning, for instance, right? So again, really putting people over process, right? And that's sort of, when we're talking about the social model, like really trying to integrate conversation, right? And trying to eliminate these barriers that exist. So I think, the Ford Foundation was really, really inclusive and really thoughtful about really integrating ways to build a culture of inclusion. And the same goes for, Jobs for the Future, right? I think we have cemented externally, right, our commitment to DEI and inclusion, including people with disabilities. So, I think there's so many ways that we can tackle, right, integrating a culture of inclusion. But I think as it relates to recruitment, really communicating, right, and really using that moment and the power of communication and language to signal to our communities that we want to embrace you, we welcome you, we want you to apply to our roles, right? So there's so many ways that we can talk on and on about inclusion and how we can go about that. But I think that's a really great first step and a way that Ford has really integrated a culture of inclusion.
Thank you so much, Joel. You pointed out communication is so important. Words matter. And that at Ford Foundation, like many other forward-thinking organizations, they do it in the very beginning, in the interview stage portion. I think that's so critical. I would like to ask you and Sarah, can you just walk us through a little bit, because some people may be unfamiliar. When you're on board, maybe you have not disclosed, or you maybe didn't think it needed an accommodation. What does it look like from any of your career experience, having the conversation with your supervisor about needing a reasonable accommodation?
I'm happy to start, Joelle, because this is a process I've been heavily involved in at OSF. So when I came on board in 2019, we had just rolled out our global disability workplace accommodations policy. It doesn't mean people weren't getting accommodations prior to the policy being rolled out, but it was very much based on your own jurisdiction and sort of the policies and processes that are embedded in that accommodations process, which I have to say, I think is uncomfortable. So you hit on something with your question that it's hard to start that dialogue with your manager or with HR, because you feel like you're putting yourself on blast, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. There's quote unquote something wrong with me, which is medical model thinking. And so I need something extra and special to do my job effectively. When in fact, if you approach it from a social model, which is how we've trained folks on the policy, is that we want you to be able to show up to work and be the most effective and work just like everyone else. So sometimes when equity comes into the picture, which is a new term that we added because we were the diversity and inclusion team and now we're the DEI team. So equity was important here because this is an issue of equity. It doesn't mean you're getting something special. You're getting something to do your job just as well as everybody else around you. And it's also about working again from that proactive frame where it's, if the environment is already set up for you, a lot of people may not need to ask for accommodations if you already have equipment or space that is accessible to start with. So our global policy went above and beyond again, so beyond compliance, to take sort of the gold standard. And a lot of times, I wish the gold standard was the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because that's one of the most beautifully written progressive documents on disability access in the world, but the US has not signed that convention. So we are working in the parameters of the ADA, or for example, in the UK, again, the UK Equality Act. Those are the two I have the most familiarity with. And so we're saying that, yes, we have to follow these laws and rules, but no matter where you are in the world that you work within our foundation, you do have access to accommodations. And I think that was really important. It also centralized the budget. So the budget is out of my team. It is not within each program, or it's not even a human rights general budget. They have to come to DEI to get that access to the budget. And that makes it a lot easier and less burdensome for managers and programs to say, this person needs this accommodation and it costs $500,000 or whatever, which most accommodations are less than $500. But if they're asking for a certain cost item, and that puts pressure on the team, they don't have to worry about that. It's part of our budget. So I think streamlining the accommodations policy was one of the first things that we did. And then when we communicated the policy, we communicated it in a way of I'm obviously a very high disclosure person. So if I'm communicating, hey, I'm disabled and this is why accommodations are wonderful. And that actually over time, and it's taken years, believe me, it's not like we're there yet, but it has helped to sort of ease the fear of disclosure, because we've started to, as Emily Ladau's book tells us, to demystify disability. This isn't something that is taboo. So maybe we can all have a book club within our organizations with Emily's book, because to start that dialogue. And I think that in conjunction with a streamlined policy helps.
Awesome.
Sorry.
No, that was on point. And yes, if you haven't checked out Emily's book, please go out. We're going to drop it in the chat how you can get the book. And I love what you said about maybe having a book club in our organization. That's a really good idea. Before we move on to the next point, Joel, do you want to tap into your experience with in HR and the process of reasonable accommodations?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, this conversation about self-ID is so personal for me. I mean, and thinking back to my journey, it's been really hard. I'm gonna be honest, y'all. It's been really, really hard. You know, with my autoimmune, I have scleroderma. So really, I'm still learning what this disease is, right? And so when we talk about self-ID, reasonable accommodations, I genuinely didn't even know where to start. Like there was so many things that I feel like I needed that, I mean, I can go on and on, but I think as we talk about self-ID, you know, we talk about, you know, disability inclusion and accommodations. I think one of the most important elements of building a disability inclusive workplace is ultimately a supervisor's partnership and accountability. Right? And I say that because, you know, oftentimes when we disclose a disability, right, we might not do it in the application process. We might not do it during onboarding. It might happen, you know, sometime after 1 or 2, 3 months, a year after we've started our organization, right? So understanding, right, what type of commitment do we have, right, in our organizations to ensuring that our teams, our direct reports understand that we have their backs, right, that we can support them, right, in anything that they need, right? Again, oftentimes we may not be in a place in our journey to disclose, right, whether or not we're suffering from depression, right, or anxiety, or PTSD, or OCD, right, and on, and especially in this moment of COVID, right, that we're living through. So, you know, when we talk about self-ID, it's really important to embed a culture of, you know, having a conversation with your team, having a simple conversation during a check-in, right, like how you're doing. What type of support do you need, right? How can I best support you to, you know, fully be engaged in your work? So, you know, when I was diagnosed with scleroderma, right, it's a disease that affects the joints. It's a disease that tightens the skin and the collective tissue. So I had no idea, right? I had no idea what it meant for my life. I had no idea or no clue about, you know, what it is that I needed from myself, let alone what I needed to communicate to my manager on how to best support me, right? So again, I feel like conversation, when it comes to self-ID, I think the grounding really ultimately starts with building a culture that says, if you need anything, right, or checking in, having those simple conversations is really important. So when I joined Ford, I got diagnosed in 2016, in like July or August of 2016. I joined Ford a year later. And, you know, I honestly, throughout that year, I had not accepted the fact that I was a new, you know, this identity, right? I had not lived into what this meant. I was scared. I was nervous, anxious. I mean, you name it. I had no idea what this meant for me. So, you know, I knew that I had to mention it. I knew that I had to mention and self-disclose, because I knew that my life was changing already, right? Like I didn't look like the way I used to look before, right? My skin was getting tighter. I honestly didn't know what this meant in terms of accommodation. So it was really scary. It was really, really scary, because for the first time, this was the moment that I had to self-ID. And I was just like, I didn't realize, right? I didn't know that I was going to be in this moment. So the way that my supervisor, the way that the PNC team handled it was just incredible. incredibly supportive, right? And again, this goes back to the social model. It goes back to the interactive process and having that conversation with your staff and figuring out what it is that we need to provide to our staff to fully support them, right? Whether it means that, you know, we're allowing our staff to work remotely when they're experiencing flare-ups, right? Or when they're experiencing an episode of whatever they may be experiencing. So support goes a long way. I mean, when I talk about self-ID and when I talk about accommodations, it really ultimately comes down to support and how we're communicating that, right? We can talk about compliance, we can talk about doctor's notes all day, but what I need to know is that you're going to support me and that you understand that this journey is not easy. And that, I think, you know, really, really helps us at Jobs for the Future. Well, I'll stop there because I can go on and on and on about this conversation, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joel. Thank you for being vulnerable. We've talked offline, Sarah, myself, you, both Emily's, about, yes, learning about our disabilities ourselves. It's a process. It is a journey. Seems like a voyage at times. So being able to articulate that to our employer, we need a welcoming environment, just like you said. And we will continue this discussion on another forum about that in particular. So thank you for being vulnerable. Accommodations, disclosures, self-ID, those are all things that we know that can be a little challenging. And the one demographic I always tell people that we can all fall into at any given time, and that's becoming an individual with a disability. So does your organization ask about self-identification on surveys? Sometimes they do it in the beginning when you first start, you see those questions, or maybe mid-year. But we'd like to do a poll, the second poll question to ask this question. Does your organization ask a self-identification question in surveys? Because throughout the year, through the course of our life, we can all become an individual with a disability. So we're glad that you have this question and you're answering it. And the second part to the question is, do you actually feel comfortable self-disclosing? I'm glad that a great amount of you right now are saying yes, you actually feel comfortable, and some are not sure if they are being asked to self-ID, fill out a form. It's usually anonymous, just stating if you have a certain disability. And so right now the poll shows 55% says yes, they are being asked. And 30% no, and 14% they don't know. And as far as are you comfortable, the percentage that have answered the question is 41% that says they are. So it looks like that we, as collectively, as practitioners in HR, diversity, equity, inclusion that work hand in hand together, might need to do a better job at handling that. So has the state space been created to enable and encourage people to disclose their disability? That sounds like a lot of what Sarah and Joel have been talking about, having a supervisor that you feel comfortable going to, being able to see in the marketing materials, people who look like you, whether you're visually impaired, whether you're using a walking cane like I do, or whether you're of brown pigmentation, but someone who looks like you even in their marketing. Let's discuss the requirements to get a doctor's notes. Can you both respond to the poll information and the part about when you're requesting a disability and the need when you have a non-apparent disability to get a medical note? What have you experienced?
This is one of my biggest points of contention with the whole accommodations process. When I worked at a small community college in Minnesota years ago, Inver Hills Community College, we had implemented, at that time, it was actually quite revolutionary because this was like 12 or 13 years ago. And we were trying to be progressive and no doctor's notes were needed. We really wanted to embrace that social model perspective and, you know, wanted to create an environment where students felt welcomed, respected, valued, and didn't have to go through the hoops to produce that note. That was the last environment that I worked in that was the case. When I came to OSF in 2018, it really was, part of the usual process of requesting accommodations. I wasn't around when they created the policy, the global policy, but it really was rooted in medical model. And I think if you look at any kind of global disability policy, 99% of the time, it's going to be a medical model perspective, which says, there's something wrong with you, you need a doctor's note, instead of just relying on, lived experience and stories. And also the fact that most people are not going to lie about what they need, right? And also most accommodations will help most of us do our work better. It's not just that this is something special that you need on your computer or at your desk to help access your work better. It's actually a lot of us need these tools. When I came in and I requested a specific accommodation that was based on my hearing differences, they had asked me for a doctor's note regarding that. And I felt like it was so silly to ask me for a doctor's note. I even took out my hearing aid and said, look, I wear a hearing aid. And that still wasn't enough. I said I needed a doctor's note. And I was like, yeah, I'm just wearing these because they're fun and fashionable. I mean, they are pretty fashionable, but I said, I was really confused. I did talk to our legal team. They, verified with myself that actually wasn't necessary. So they worked with an HR and said, look, this is a bit ridiculous. I don't think she needs a doctor's note for this. But then when it came to have the flexible work options because of my medical conditions, which Joelle, I am also in the autoimmune. I also have a very similar skin condition. So it was fun to know that we're in the same family. So hearts. But I have to do a lot of, I'm in doctor's visits like 2 or 3 times a week sometimes, or different medical procedures. And so my flexible work schedule is really important. That became much more complicated, and the need for, I would have to produce like 12 doctors notes. It was so much to produce. It just seemed very burdensome, and the process shouldn't be burdensome. So for us, it's really, I've established such a great relationship with my manager that I'm able to flex my hours in a way that work between me and my manager. And I think we've created that atmosphere at OSF that you can work with your manager. But a lot of people, as Joelle talked about, are not ready to disclose. So if you're not in a space of disclosure, you'd have to go through a confidential process with HR. And then that process would require those medical notices. So I think that's a very complicated space to be. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer. But I'd say, like, coming to conversations like this, dialoguing with peers, having employee resource groups or affinity groups that are dedicated to disability, so you're getting peer support. We have this at OSF. They have this at Ford. We have one for the President's Council called Celebrating Disability Across Philanthropy. We have a meeting next week. That was my shameless plug insert to get you all into that meeting. But having a space where you can dialogue and be with your peers and feel comfortable will, I think, bring you to that space where you feel comfortable to disclose, and also knowing what your legal protections are, right? So if you do feel like you're in a situation where there's retaliation, you'd be able to know how protected you are within your jurisdiction.
Absolutely. Knowing your rights is always really integral, and also navigating that conversation. It's uncomfortable, but it must be had. Joel, I'm going to ask you this question because I know you're always busy connecting with the community. He is very for it and making sure people feel comfortable. But can you tell us how this is a benefit, connecting with the community with outreach, when we're talking about access and recruitment, and how you build these wonderful relationships?
Of course, yeah, I'm happy to. Well, so the first thing that comes to mind for me is outreach. Outreach is your best friend, right? When it comes to connecting with the disability community, when it comes to making sure that these opportunities are being put in front of our people, right? I was managing the internship program at the Ford Foundation. And one of the things I and the organization was committed to, right, was to ensure that, we hired students with disabilities into our program. I can't tell you how many Office of Accessibility centers I had reached out to. I think it must have been over like 10 centers, and not a peep. not a peep, right? And so I promoted our opportunities in hopes that, these opportunities would land in front of a student, right, who was eager to be paid $24 an hour. And it was hard to believe that, and any of these centers would not reach back out to me. And I was so puzzled by that. And I understand, and I later found that a lot of these centers are also trying to help these students navigate their school journey, right? So I understood that part, but I was eager. I'm like, I know these students need experience, right? Because we know that our communities have oftentimes been limited opportunities, right? Because of, not being able to commit to full time, right? Because of the need to take care of themselves. So luckily through my research, I was like, no, this really cannot be. I'm finding it hard to believe that I cannot get these opportunities out to these students. So through my research, I was lucky to find an organization called CUNY Leads, which is a unique academic and career program for students with disabilities across the City University of New York, which is CUNY. And so I asked them if I could attend their town hall meetings, where all of their advisors from the various different CUNY schools would be together. And I was invited. They actually let me join that closed town hall meeting. And I presented on our paid internship. I was like, we need to get this out to your students. I urged them to partner, with me to build a robust pipeline of students who were in need of experience, right? Who were in need of a paid internship. And I was able to interview over 10 students, and ultimately we hired three students from that program. And again, it took hoops. It took, a lot of outreach, but outreach does work, in these moments, and specifically when we talk about recruitment. And then aside from outreach, right, aside from our regular job boards, like Ability Jobs and other diversity job boards and platforms, we ultimately had to really think outside the box, right? And have dedicated search managers and recruiters dedicated to ensuring that we're building a robust pipeline that's inclusive of people with disabilities, right? So we can partner. One of the things that I did before leaving Ford, in partnership with one of our interns, is building a list of the Centers for Independent Living, right, across all of our different regions, right? And really finding ways, again, just to build that partnership with our different communities, building and doing outreach with other disability rights and disability justice organizations, right? So I'll just say that outreach and the power of our networks is huge, and we have to be intentional about using them. We have to be our best self-advocates, for our own community.
Thank you for that. I hope that we all are taking notes. Again, I keep saying that because these are valuable nuggets that are being dropped right now. And I would just like to ask Sarah, can you talk about the hybrid model? Because we're going to hold your thought, because we're going to do a poll question first, and then we're going to talk about the results. Return to work. A lot of organizations are shifting now, and we've heard the term being agile over the last 19 months. So does your organization offer a hybrid work model where you can sometimes be in the office, sometimes work remotely? It looks like a lot of people automatically are responding and saying yes. And the second part of the question is, if yes, do you feel comfortable returning to work, being back in the building with your colleagues with a hybrid model? Because of course, we're in the age of COVID-19. Okay, so some of you are saying yes. 68% are saying yes, you feel comfortable going back. And some of you are saying that your organization does not offer. We know that if you're working with, let's say, on a medical team, that might not, depending on what the job is, be an option or something that's customer interfacing, but it says 78% of you are saying yes, and some of you are not even sure if they offer that. So let's talk a little bit more about what does the hybrid model look like. And I'm going to toss that over to Sarah.
Thank you. So yes, we at OSF currently do not have a policy in place, but it is soon to come. But I could talk a little bit about the development of our recommendations, especially as a DEI team, how much we've been involved in that process, especially if this is something that your workplace hasn't technically embarked on yet. What is it? How do you create one of these policies, or how can you put forward recommendations? I will say, I mean, we're currently in an opt-in process, which I actually was in the office for the very first time on Tuesday this week. I elected to go in. A bunch of my colleagues and I went into the office, and I was surprised at how much fun I had because I have really appreciated not being in that physical space. But you know, there's something that's definitely lost when you have your colleagues right next to you and you can get up and talk. And we have very rigid COVID policy for those of us that are in the office. So you have to wear a mask all day. You have to stay distanced. You can't eat together. You can't congregate. They have room parameters. So there's a lot of, and they have like the air ventilation has been improved. So they've been working really hard to make it a comfortable space. I don't think I'm going to go back this year if I don't have to. But I am excited about what's on the horizon and in regards to hybrid work. So, you know, again, we cannot go back to where we've been. Right? I mean, we have learned so much over the past 2 years about the benefits of remote work and the effectiveness that we can have when we work remotely. I mean, disabled folks been saying this forever. I don't even say, I don't want to say decades, I want to say centuries. We have literally, like I said, when I was a kid, I had to do so much remote and had to live my life in a space where I wasn't with my peers. And I survived and I made it, and here I am, right? So it's like, we can be effective in this way. And so I think to ignore the disabled community and the learning that we can provide to this process would be a disservice for your organization. So I think do your research, do your homework. When we put forward our recommendations to our management committee on hybrid working, we had so many appendices of research. And it wasn't just about disability. I mean, working remotely is beneficial to all sorts of folks within a DEI frame, right? For whatever identity they bring, for all sorts of reasons, do not wish to come to the office again full time. We currently are advocating for a full flexibility model, which would mean that people do not have to apply for disability related accommodations if they wish to not come into the office a certain set amount of days. But also for, again, we've put forward lots of literature and research around why it's good for lots of people. It's not just about disability here. But I don't, you know, we haven't seen the policy yet. I think that probably won't get approved. I mean, I think that would be very difficult because as someone who works in operations, not knowing sort of what your operational model will look like we currently have a 10-story building in New York City that usually houses like 500 humans. So if you don't know who's coming into the office on a given day based on full flexibility, I could see that being at a very economical and environmental, like it's not sustainable for a building to run for a certain amount of people. I think when I was there on Tuesday, there were maybe 50 of us in the whole building. So it's probably not the best model to do full flexibility, but to have that option without having people to have to jump through hoops or knowing what the process is. Currently, we have a check-in system and things are provided based on how many bodies are in the office. We also are putting together manager learning, like how to manage hybrid teams. We're currently planning our big DEI conference for April of next year will be a hybrid model conference. So having people in person, but using the tech that's now available to all of us to ensure that everybody can attend and feel comfortable. Again, having access to events and programming is something that has not always been the case for disabled folks due to their accessibility needs. So that's something that this pandemic has shown us. And I think it would be horrible if we didn't take some learning into account when we're returning to work.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask Joel, can you share your final thoughts on this conversation about disability in the workplace, HR and employee participation? And then I'm going to pass it back to Sarah. I'm going to say a few words and then we're going to pass it back to Emily H. So just any final thoughts that you would like to leave the participants with, Joel?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so much to say, and plus one to everything that you said, right before Sarah. I can't speak to where Ford, is in terms of their hybrid model. I know that when I was there, the Ford Foundation is super, super thoughtful in having, the staff work remotely. I know in September, there was a reopening phase where people who wanted and needed to be in the office could, but here currently at Jobs for the Future, we have a really, really amazing policy, and it's a flex paid time off policy. So when we're thinking about our policies in our organizations, how supportive are these policies for our staff, inclusive of our staff with disabilities, right? And that particular, flex PTO pay time off policy really gives the employees, right, the freedom that they require to balance their responsibilities based on their own needs, right? The organization also demonstrates, right, that they trust their employees to make the best decisions about how to manage their work, right? So that approach to pay time off, right, including vacation time and sick time and discretionary time, really eliminates the need for accrual, right, of pay time off days, and instead gives employees that agency, right, again, to make their own professional judgment, with approval of their managers. But we can take agency in deciding when and for how long. And I know that many organizations are in different places in that journey, but I think it's worth noting that a hybrid model or a remote, allowing staff to work remotely, really does allow for the inclusion to be able to attend events, right? So if I'm experiencing a flare up, right, I can attend an event virtually. In December, we have an all staff meeting where typically at Jobs for the Future, everyone will have to come in person. This time it's a hybrid model. So we're having our events in person, but we'll also be hosting them virtually. So at the moment, Jobs for the Future, 40% of our workforce is remote. 40%, which is a pretty large number from where they had been. So again, it's really demonstrated a culture of inclusion, a culture of support, and allowed for staff to really engage in a different way. And then one final thing that I'll share that I was so proud and happy to be a part of at Ford was our employee resource groups, right? Like making sure that we have spaces, even if our organization is a 10-person organization, 50-person, like what kind of space are we creating to allow people to engage, right, with lived and shared experiences? And another thing that I'll mention is that, Sarah, you pointed out in your conversation, is a budget, right? Do we have a budget for accommodations, right? Instead of having to scramble when an accommodation need does come up, right? Are we ensuring that we have funding to support our staff in order for them to be fully engaged and committed to their work? So I'll leave those 3 nuggets. But again, so happy to be here and to be in conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Joel. Please stand by because we have questions. Sarah, can you please share your final thoughts on this topic before we go into the question segment?
Actually, I was what Joel had said had sparked my thoughts on training and programming, because this idea of budgets for the bare minimum, right? Like what we need to provide for people to be effective, but are we also ensuring that people understand why we're having this dialogue and conversation in the first place? And that's something I just wanted to really briefly touch on, especially since, I'm from the DEI team within HR, and a lot of times folks do not think of disability within a DEI lens. But every time you talk about disability, you need to talk about it in an intersectional way. Race, gender, class, immigration status, all these things really impact how we interact with our disability. And so I think it's really important that DEI teams take disability identity as a major point of conversation and dialogue. And I think it's not useful to take this out of justice and equity conversations that are already happening in other spaces. So I would just say that, an example of this was I understand that not everyone's going to have someone dedicated within their DEI team or within their HR team or in their organization that's doing disability inclusion work. So I realize that my example here is not going to be fair to every organization. But my background is I'm a trainer. So I created a really basic virtual foundational disability 101 training that was rolled out to 97% of our operational teams. And so that's all of HR, legal, IT, facilities, communications, all the folks that make our organization run. And this was because our global director of operations made it a priority for disability inclusion to be embedded in all of these teams. We did not require the training. So that's another thing too. If you mandate DEI training, then it just becomes a mandated thing that everybody has to check their box. Okay, I attended that. You have to make people want to learn. You have to make it engaging and exciting. And yes, disability is important. We need to talk about this. And luckily for me, I was able to bring videos in and interactive components. And, we had all of the leaders of all these teams attend, and then it all went back to everyone else. And I mean, I did have to run it 20 times, but at the end of it, people were like, oh, everyone's told me I have to attend this training. They learned so much. And then every team then contacted me on ways that they can make their teams more disability friendly and inclusive. What are we doing? And now we're doing an inclusive office project around neurodiversity, accessibility. So many different things are happening now because of this really quick little objective that was put in our operation procedures that we should think about disability. And then we were able to get excitement from the programming side of the house that were like, oh, give us this training too. So I would say if this is something you're interested in, I mean, in really embedding disability inclusion within your organizations, you do need to make it exciting. You need to make people want to learn. So, feel free to reach out to myself. I could put you in contact with lots of consultants that have lots of energy around these topics. Or like I said, do a book club. There's some easy ways that you can make it a priority because it's hard to talk about changing the way we think about disability from a medical model to a social model if we don't understand why we're having that dialogue to start with, right? There has to be interest and commitment from folks to understand that this is a priority.
Thank you, Sarah.
Dr. Zakia, can I just make a final comment?
Of course.
Now Sarah ignited a spark in my thought process as you were talking about trainings, because I think it's so important, not only to make it fun and engaging, Sarah, but it's also helpful when these trainings are raising awareness, right? Because they reduce stigma of our people, of being disabled. These trainings are necessary, right? And like Sarah said, there's so many ways to make these things engaging for staff. I know at the Ford Foundation, Catherine Townsend, who's a senior advisor in the president's office, who does amazing work. She held a disability dish session for 30 minutes, right? During lunch hours, right? Where people just came in and could ask her anything around disability inclusion, right? So I know one of the other things that we did at Ford was a simple person first language fact sheet. I mean, I was mind blown. I was like, this is so incredible, right? Just in sharing what person first language is and what we should and should not be addressing, or how we should be addressing our community. So training is absolutely important and necessary.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention, because it is. I'm a firm believer that storytelling is a catalyst for change. When we share our lived experiences, both on a personal level and a professional level, it really has the way to open up and change people's mindsets, because they may hear something that might spark an interest and say, okay, the light bulb just went off. I now finally understand. With that being said, when we're conducting and curating these experiences, we will hope to be in an organization where you truly feel like you can thrive, belong, and show up as your authentic self. So I appreciate you both sharing your experiences. We all have lots of stories that we can tell to help you really get it. But since you're on this call today, we know that you want to help move that inclusion needle. So with that being said, I'm going to pass the mic over to Emily, who has a couple of announcements, and then we'll go into our questions. Thank you so much.
Muted doesn't work. Thank you, Zakia, Joelle, and Sarah. This has been an incredible conversation, and I'm so excited it can continue. So please stay with us for another 30 minutes if you can, or as long as you can. For those of you leaving now, we just wanted to make a few announcements. First of all, please help us learn from your experience by taking a few minutes to fill out a survey that is in the chat and should pop up after you leave the Zoom. Your feedback will inform the future Journey to Inclusion series. Also, as Sarah mentioned, we have upcoming a meeting of our first ever cross-philanthropy employee resource group called Celebrating Disability Across Philanthropy, or CDAP. There's a link in the chat to, or will be, to that meeting registration. Thank you, Pat. This group is designed for individuals working in philanthropy who self-identify as disabled and/or who want to champion disability inclusion in their organizations. We'll be continuing the conversation about disability in the workplace, and Sarah as a co-chair, as was Joel while he was at Ford. We also have many, many resources, as you know, on the Disability and Philanthropy Forum. If you do not, if you're not a member, you should be if you're in this meeting, but if you snuck in, please be sure to join the forum. It's free for anybody working in philanthropy. Please invite your colleagues to join us as well. As a reminder, if your foundation is serious about its journey to inclusion, we hope you will join members of the President's Council on Disability, Inclusion, and Philanthropy and 56 organizations in signing on to our Disability Inclusion Pledge. You can find out more at the Disability and Philanthropy Forum website. And finally, next year, we will be continuing this series as well as our public webinar series. So stay tuned for announcements. Our first session in February will be on mental health in the workplace, and an announcement will come out in the next couple months about that. So now I want to turn things back to Zakia and our panelists and remind you, you can either ask your questions in the chat or feel free. We will try to keep an eye on who's coming off of mute and recognize you if you would like to speak up directly. And I know these folks have so much to talk about. Even if you don't have questions, they're going to keep going. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Emily. So please, this is an opportunity for you to ask any questions. As you can see, the three of us are not very shy. We're very open to answering questions. So please just let us know what are some of your questions. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, let's talk about data. How important is it to capture data and how data paints an accurate picture of what's going on in your organization? I will just toss that out right now.
While we're waiting, I'll just say we just released our first well-being survey to the whole network. As many of you probably know, besides the pandemic, the Open Society Foundation has been experiencing a transformation. So we're going through a restructure that has put a lot of pressure and stress on our staff. So we decided to, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of organizations do, sort of a pulse check to see how people are doing. And we have embraced transformative mental health. It's a human rights, trauma-informed, culturally specific, relevant approach to mental health practices within our organization. And we put that under our disability inclusion umbrella work. And so our recent well-being survey is really meant to see if the strategies that we've implemented are working, if it's serving our staff effectively, if they find it useful, and then also to see if there's particular offices that require certain interventions or support in a different way. But we're approaching mental health in the same way that we approach any disability-related conversation, in a proactive manner. So we can try to address things and have things in place before there is any need for it to be there. So I think data is vital. We don't collect disability status data. within our organization. And I think it's a huge disservice because I know that, I mean, globally, it's like 1 in 4, 1 in 3 people have a disability of some sort, right? So there's, I think it's doing a disservice to not having those numbers, but we've come against lots of barriers with different regions not letting us legally collect that data. So we don't know how to do it for some of our offices and then not for others. So it's been a constant dialogue.
Thank you, Sarah. Joel, do you want to talk about data and how that helps with our DEI efforts?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is that data is so important because it really allows us to really make informed decisions, right? Oftentimes, some of our organizations, we don't even know where to start, right? So I think surveys, right, really allow us to just get a pulse check, right, on what is our current workforce looking like at this moment, and how many people self-identify as having, as a person with a disability, right? So we can understand our starting point so that we can, continue to have a plan, right, for improving disability inclusion practices. So I think surveys are ultimately really, really important in order to gauge, where the organization is, in that disability inclusion journey.
Thank you. And it was just mentioned talking about mental health. Can we talk a little bit about what does sociological safety look like in organizations and how does that relate to organizational culture?
Can you repeat that question again, Dr. Zakia?
Sure. So sociological safety, how does that relate to having a healthy organizational culture?
Yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit, especially in the last couple of years. Again, I think our mental health work kicked off in 2019, right before the pandemic. And I think probably for a lot of you that work on human rights related issues, people can be triggered or put in spaces because of the nature of the work that we do. I think just being a DEI practitioner means that you're constantly putting yourself up in spaces that are difficult and emotionally draining, and people don't feel safe and aren't given those parameters to again, like, how can I be my authentic self or bring myself to work when I don't have the environment hasn't been built for me to feel safe, right? We've actually, a lot of our trainings, we use the language of bravery and putting ourselves in spaces that are brave, because I don't feel comfortable talking about safe space when I can't ensure it, because I can't control a lot of other aspects of the dynamics of the organization. So I try to be authentic in that because I think it's, I also think that's true when you're talking about disability in general. Like, you recruit disabled candidates, you bring in folks from a diversity of abilities and identity, and then you don't have, you haven't built that psychological safety, you haven't built that space of safety or have the services and things in place to support that staff member. So I think that we have to be honest about where we are and the kind of environment that we're building. I think a lot of it has to do with manager training and also ensuring that our operational teams are interacting with staff in a place of empathy. And I think that's been difficult for us, especially because you have I think probably 3/4 of our managers are wonderful, right? And they really do come to our trainings and they really try to be supportive and create those structures of safety. But then you have that small percentage that aren't attending those trainings and aren't sort of implementing those strategies. And then that impacts the whole organization. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's vital. And I think it has to go back to self-ID too. If you're creating an environment where people feel safe, then your employees are going to thrive. There's so much data on this. You could see Forbes or whatever, people are going to be much more motivated and effective, and your output and productivity is going to be so much higher if folks feel safe and well and able to bring their whole selves to work.
Absolutely. Thank you. I see a question in the chat for Joel. My former employer was concerned about allowing applicants to call to request accommodations because he didn't want to feel flooded with calls. How do we address issues that create barriers for individuals who may have different communication needs?
Yeah, I mean, I know it might be a bit scary to put a phone number out there, but there has to be some type of communication whether it be an email, right, to just a standard HR email that goes into an HR inbox, but there has to be a space where people can request accommodation. So if phone calls aren't necessarily going to work for your organization, do we have a dedicated HR inbox that someone is constantly monitoring so that we ensure that we're addressing any accommodation needs? If our organization has a customer service department that's fielding different inquiries, making sure that that staff is trained on fielding and also forwarding any accommodation requests. So there has to be a place where applicants can request accommodations, whether it be a phone call or whether it be an email or generic email that can direct people to requesting those needs.
Thank you for that. That's very important. Does anybody want to unmic and just tell us some of the nuggets that you've learned from this conversation today? You don't have to undo your picture if you don't want, but can you just unmic and just share something?
Hi, I can jump in. I'm Alex MacArthur with the Taproot Foundation, and just wanted to say it really resonated with me as an individual with disability to think about what your own accommodation needs are and not always knowing what those are, and just being able to have that relationship with your manager and how important that is, or with the organization, to be able to say that, right? I don't know exactly what I need, but want to work through that with you together. So I just appreciate the stories that you shared.
Can I jump in there? Thanks for sharing that. That is something that I know I personally can relate to. I remember my manager when I came on board at OSF saying, what are your disability related accommodations? And first I was just pleased they asked me that without making any assumptions about what I might need. Because there is always an assumption if you have a hearing difference that you need an ASL interpreter, but my ASL is primitive at best. And I don't have, because I started going deaf much later in life. And so I asked for captions. And then when I asked for captions, nobody knew how to get captions. It was like this very long process to try to figure it out. And because our video conferencing software didn't have the capability. But since then, and this is something I will add as another nugget maybe, we've brought in, he's an assistive software professional. So he is a consultant who, if we have anybody who come in who might have, they're not quite sure what they need. They're not, they have this, I know I need some support, but I'm not really sure. We usually send them to, his name is Charlie Danger, which I love because he sounds like a secret agent spy. So we send them to Charlie Danger and then he works with them and he's just able to think it through with them in a way that even though I've done accommodation implementation in past lives, I don't know what's out there now. I don't know what's new and current as far as tech goes. And he's able to really help them figure it out. And if we don't have it already kind of through our security channel, which takes a long time, we try to have enough software in place that can cover the basics, but then we're able to maybe find a new piece of software we can bring on for more staff. So having an individual like that you can collaborate with and talk to is, I think, essential. It does require budget and energy to find these humans and work with them, but I think they're out there and it's really useful because it's hard. HR practitioners don't really know unless they've gone through some training on, I had to go to the AHEAD conference, which I don't know if people are familiar with. It's a higher ed conference on education and disability. And they do some service certification. And then there's also the Assistive Tech Association, which is another certification I've done. But even going through all that, I still don't think I'd be able to help people figure out what they need if it was my full-time job, maybe. So I just appreciate that it's difficult and having someone open to learning and helping you figure that out is so nice.
Yes, having someone open to learning a new process, because a lot of people are closed off to new ideas. A resource that I have found most helpful over a decade is the Job Accommodation Network, JAN. You can actually put in what your disability is, and it gives you some information about accommodations that have worked well. And I say this as an employee with multiple disabilities and also on the employer side, because you can call in and they can actually, you can tell them your scenario and they can give you feedback. They're in West Virginia, the number, you can just simply call them. And they also do, I think, trainings for, I know they did it when I was a federal and government employee. So that's another good resource, jan.org. And so I think when we're talking about reasonable accommodation, we spend a lot of time there because that's a lot of that people don't understand. And I think Joel and Sarah hit it on the nail on the head when they talk about middle managers. That seems to be a lot of times a disconnect. I have worked on the MD 715, which is a document that goes to EEOC for many years, and it shows where you're underrepresented. And I also know in the civilian workforce, there are other surveys that can be done just to see where you can improve on your numbers. And I see so many beautiful faces and names and smiles that is really encouraging. Liz, I have to know.
Oh, no, it died.
It always pauses like at the most random places.
Right. So what did she say?
Would you like to share? You've had a beautiful smile the entire time. Would you like to share anything?
So many things. As a middle manager, I admit I've been guilty of not offering or feeling, I don't know, somehow like maybe we couldn't get as much work done. I'm going to admit it. But I did have somebody that worked with me that needed a reasonable accommodation. And we did give it to them and got it available for them. But I feel like it probably wasn't necessarily handled great. And this was not at the foundation I'm currently at. And I work for the Foundation for Physical Therapy Research because I have a daughter who had very mild cerebral palsy. And I always feel like it's not my story to share, it's more hers. But this gives me a lot of tools to help her with the accommodations that she needs. I know I've asked for them throughout for school and those kind of things. And we've done so much physical therapy that looking at her, you may not see a need for an accommodation. But we've kind of tried to feel through it and ask for those as we've gone along. And she does need some accommodations as we go through this. And I think that's something that as she's become a teenager and a freshman in high school, that now we're like really looking at this. And then my older daughter, the same thing, she started a job at the University of Iowa libraries. And that was the first question out of their mouth. Do you need any accommodations? And she just felt so great to have them just offer that and ask that question. So yes, I'm going to push our foundation to sign on to the pledge and see what else we can do. And then I'm a member of the Health Research Alliance, and we are having our big meetings this week. And there's a gentleman that's also a member who is vision impaired and talked about yesterday sitting through the PowerPoint presentations and then not having somebody read everything that was on the PowerPoint. So then it was not, he missed that part of the presentation and conversation. So, and I'm looking at our webinars as well to offer that, because I do know that there's physical therapists out there that also need accommodation and for attendance at our Zooms that we are offering for young, well, not young, but emerging physical therapy researchers. So thank you so much for putting this all together and sharing it.
Thank you for your vulnerability, because that is very helpful. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here, Dr. Zakia, and second that and thank Liz for being super transparent and sharing that story. I do have to run to prep for another meeting that I am facilitating, but I'm going to drop my email in the chat if anyone wants to reach out, grab coffee, virtually chat, feel free to send me an email. But it was so great to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Joel. You're wonderful
Bye-bye.
as always. We'll chat soon.
Okay, thank you all. Take care.
And I'm dropping my link with my information. If you want to connect later for anything, let me know as well. And we're just going to have a couple more questions, and then we're going to be wrapping this up. Let's see. Emily L., would you like to share anything?
I certainly can if you want, but I mean,
Of course.
I think that everybody has really summed up everything so beautifully, and I'm grateful to you, Sarah, for shouting out my book. And I would also love to encourage everyone who's still with us to follow the Disability and Philanthropy Forum across social media so that we can stay connected in that way. I will post all the links to that in the chat. It's a great way to keep your learning journey going and to stay on top of all of the resources that we're sharing. So thanks for the opportunity to, pop a little plug in.
You're welcome, and thank you for everything that you do. And I'm going to, with that, pass the mic back over to Emily H.
Thank you so much again. As we said, we will continue as long up to 1:30 as the group can go, and it seems like people are having to get to their next meetings like Joelle. So I just want to thank the two of you who are here and Joelle in absence. This has been a fabulous conversation. I have 8 million more questions and I will keep sending them to you. And I also just wanted to acknowledge Liz, who sent a really interesting note to me directly about how one organization in Iowa is substituting the word mental health with brain health to use that as an interesting way to start interrupting stigma. So I thought that was really interesting, and thank you for that. Thanks again. We will be back. Sign up if you can, if you put in the chat one more time, Pat, the CDAP meeting next week. We would love to see you there and look forward to seeing you on the forum in the next year.
Thank you so much, everyone. If you feel free to drop your connection information in the chat so we can stay in touch.
Thank you so much. And this does conclude today's webinar. Have a fabulous day and thank you for your participation. Take care.